The thing about having a birthday when nobody acknowledged it was that the day had a way of going on longer than usual. Harry Potter turned 7 on a Thursday in July, and he knew it was his birthday because he had marked the kitchen calendar in pencil 3 weeks before. A small circle around the 31st, drawn when Aunt Petunia was at the shops and Dudley was watching television and no one was looking. He had stood on his toes to reach it. The pencil mark was still there. Nobody, apparently, had looked. Dudley had a swimming lesson in the morning, which took up everything. Aunt Petunia ironing his swimming trunks, Uncle Vernon loading the car with Dudley's bag and water wings and extra towel, because the pool's towels were scratchy, Dudley himself making noise about whether the water would be cold, whether Harry was coming, not because he wanted Harry to come, but because asking gave him someone to make a face at. Harry said he wasn't coming. Nobody asked him twice. "You'll stay in your cupboard," Aunt Petunia said, not looking up from Dudley's zip. "And you'll be quiet." Harry said he would. The cupboard under the stairs was triangular, dim, and smelled of old coats and something faintly chemical that Harry had never managed to identify. He had lived in it all his life, or all his life that he could remember, which amounted to the same thing. There was a cot that folded down from the wall, a shelf with his few books, and a torch for when the light under the door wasn't enough, and at the back a lower shelf where he kept things he'd collected, a marble from the gutter outside, a pigeon feather, a rubber band that had arrived wrapped around the post one morning, and that he'd kept for no reason he could have explained. He had never opened the cardboard box at the very back of that shelf. He'd always assumed it was something of Dudley's. Broken toys, perhaps, or old baby things that had migrated from upstairs. But Dudley's cast-offs ended up in Harry's wardrobe, his room, the hallway, the spare room. They didn't end up here. The cupboard under the stairs was Harry's space. More thoroughly than any other part of the house was Dudley's, precisely because nobody else wanted it. He pulled the box out now, in the quiet of a Thursday birthday morning, because he had nothing else to do, and the day was going to be long regardless. It was a shoebox. Light. When he shook it, the contents shifted with a papery rustle. Letters. Harry sat cross-legged on his cot and looked at them in the thin light from under the door. There were 15 or 20 in all, bundled in 3 loose groups with string that had gone slack with age, on envelopes that ranged from thick cream paper to ordinary white to one that was pale blue, the color of a February sky. He opened the first carefully, pushing his glasses up his nose with one finger, the way he always did when he wanted to concentrate. It was addressed to his aunt, beginning "Dear Miss Evans," his aunt's maiden name, which was his mother's too. It was a formal letter, careful and old-fashioned, signed at the bottom Albus Dumbledore, and underneath, in slightly smaller handwriting, E. Doge, co-signed. The letter mentioned arrangements of some kind, and someone called A. Fig, described as the one to watch over him. Harry read it twice and felt something odd and sideways happen in his chest, because he knew A. Fig. Mrs. Fig, Mrs. Arabella Fig, 2 streets away on Wisteria Walk, who smelled of cats and made him sit through photographs of cats, and whose sofas were perpetually covered in cat hair. That Mrs. Fig. He set that letter aside and opened the second bundle. These were written in a different hand, looser, rounder, with letters that looped extravagantly, difficult to read, but somehow beautiful. The return address on the outermost envelope was a student's room somewhere, from years before Harry was born. He could tell they were his mother's without quite knowing how, the way you can sometimes recognize something before you understand the evidence, something in the rhythm of them, something in the way the sentences ran slightly longer than they needed to, as though the person writing was in love with the act of writing itself. He read 3 of them slowly. She'd written, in one, "Remus sends his love. He always does, it's very like him." And tucked inside that same envelope was a second, smaller one addressed to R.J. Lupin, with a forwarding address beneath. In another letter she mentioned my friend from home, Severus, who has moved to Spinner's End in Cokeworth, and gave a street number. She mentioned the huge man Dumbledore trusts, Hagrid, the one who'll bring you safely when the time comes. Harry went still at that sentence, and read it again. She mentioned Sirius, Harry's godfather. "You'll meet him yourself one day, I know it." A second formal letter from Dumbledore mentioned Andromeda Tonks, Sirius's cousin who left the family, a sound woman with a partial address. Beside Dumbledore's signature, Doge again. Harry sat for a long time in the half-dark. He was 7 years old today, and he knew almost nothing about where he came from. His aunt said his parents had died in a car crash, and this had always seemed slightly wrong. Not impossible, just wrong, the way a sum can look right and still give you the wrong answer when you check your working. It wasn't a feeling he could explain. It was just there. The same way the scar on his forehead was just there. A lightning bolt shape, just above his right eye, which also seemed like a peculiar thing to get from a car accident if you were a baby being safely strapped in. He thought about the word godfather. He knew what it meant. Someone who was supposed to look after you if your parents couldn't. He sat in the dim of his cupboard on his 7th birthday and wondered what kind of accident it would have to be, exactly, to take 2 parents at once and leave no one to look after the child but an aunt who put him in a cupboard and a jar of 40 pence on a shelf. He got out his school notebook and tore 9 strips from the back pages, carefully, along the margin. Then he copied names and addresses in his neatest handwriting, Albus Dumbledore and Elphias Doge from the formal envelope, Minerva McGonagall from a smaller document tucked inside the bundle, countersigned beside something official-looking. Mrs. Figg, Wisteria Walk, Little Whinging, R.J. Lupin, forwarding address, Hagrid, Hogwarts. The letters called him Gamekeeper, which wasn't precisely an address, but he wrote it and hoped. Sirius Black, England. He had no better address than that, so he wrote it and hoped harder. Severus, Spinner's End, Cokeworth. Andromeda Tonks, partial address, written out as completely as he could manage. On a clean page from the middle of the notebook, where the paper was freshest, he wrote 1 letter. He kept it short because he didn't know what else to say, and because short seemed more likely to be answered than long. "My name is Harry Potter. I am 7 years old today. I think you knew my parents. My aunt says they died in a car crash, but I don't think that's true. Please write back if you can. My address is 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey." He copied it 8 more times. He had 40 pence in a small jar kept behind the marble on the back shelf. He stopped at the corner shop on the way to the post box and spent 36 of it on stamps. The Dursleys came back from swimming at 12:30. He heard the car in the drive, Dudley demanding lunch, his uncle's fond exasperation, his aunt's heels quick on the kitchen tiles. He had been back in his cupboard for 40 minutes by then, the notebook returned to its shelf, the shoebox precisely where it had always been. If either of them had looked in, they would have seen nothing different. The letters were in his pocket. He waited until his aunt called Dudley for sandwiches, and his uncle settled into his armchair with the newspaper, and then he walked out the front door in the casual way he sometimes did, turned left instead of right, and went to the post box at the end of Privet Drive. He posted them 1 at a time, which took longer than he'd expected, feeding each envelope through the slot, listening to the small sound it made as it landed on the others. 9 letters, 1 for each name. He didn't know what he expected. He told himself he was expecting nothing, because that was more sensible. But walking back up the road in the thin July sunshine, Harry Potter found that his hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold, because it was not cold. From something else. Something that sat just adjacent to hope, for which he didn't quite have a word yet. For 14 mornings, Harry positioned himself in the hallway before the post arrived. He learned the postman's schedule quickly. The motorbike reached their road between 8:20 and 8:40, depending on the weather and what it had done to the main road. He learned that Aunt Petunia heard the letter slot from the kitchen, because her hearing was sharp, and because she moved fast when she thought something needed collecting. He learned that he was faster, if he was already there. And so he was, every morning for 2 weeks, standing at the end of the hall in the dim before anyone else was properly awake, watching envelopes drop through the slot and sorting through them quickly by name, and finding every morning that none of them said Harry Potter. Bills for Uncle Vernon, printed in the formal font of utility companies, a garden centre catalogue, a postcard that Petunia identified from the handwriting as someone she didn't particularly like, a charity appeal that went straight in the bin. Nothing for Harry. On the 5th morning he found the exception, his own letter to Sirius Black, returned in a new outer envelope, stamped across the front in red ink, undeliverable. Below that, return to sender. Recipient held, H.M. Prison, Azkaban, North Sea. His original envelope was inside, the handwriting, Sirius Black, England, visible through a small window in the front. He stood in the hall and looked at the word Azkaban. He didn't know what it was. H.M. Prison was ordinary enough, the sort of thing you heard about on the news, walls and gates. But Azkaban, North Sea. His godfather, according to his mother's letter, was in a prison somewhere in the North Sea, and there was apparently a ministry involved in the returning, which was a word that meant something, though he didn't know yet what. He kept that piece of information with him for the rest of the day, without arriving anywhere useful with it. What Harry could not see from the end of the hallway at number 4 was what was happening elsewhere. This is what was happening. In his office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore had read the letter on the morning it arrived, with his half-moon spectacles low on his crooked nose, and the particular quiet around him that the castle assumed when most of its occupants were gone. He read it in the careful way. He read things that carried weight, without the expressions people sometimes showed when reading difficult things. Then he held it for a moment. From his perch in the corner, Fawkes watched and said nothing. Dumbledore put the letter in the bottom left drawer of his desk and locked it. He told himself this was for Harry's own good. He told himself this with the ease of a man for whom that particular calculation had become invisible with repetition. He returned to his work. He did not send word to Lupin. It did not occur to him that he needed to. Minerva McGonagall had received hers at Hogwarts, addressed correctly to Professor M. McGonagall, and she went directly to Dumbledore's office the same afternoon. She stood before his desk and told him that Harry Potter had written to her, that the boy was 7 years old, that he was asking questions that any child with half his history would be asking, and that he was asking them because nobody had answered them for the past 6 years, a failure she laid plainly at the feet of Dumbledore's arrangement. She said this in the level, precise tone she used when she was angry enough that any other tone would have been dangerous. She had used this tone with him before, in November 1981, standing outside this same building before the boy was even through the door. She had been overruled then. The set of her face as she stood at his desk told him she was prepared to be overruled again, but that she wished him to feel the full weight of it. He looked at her over his spectacles and said it was not yet time. She did not look at him when she left. The letter arrived at the gamekeeper's hut by owl, and Hagrid read it standing in the middle of the room, which was how he read most things. By the time he reached the last line, he was crying in the open, unguarded way he had, with his huge hands pressed to his face and his broad chest heaving. He had known James and Lily. He had carried Harry out of the wreckage at Godric's Hollow on the first night of November, tucked inside Hagrid's coat because the night was cold and the blanket wasn't warm enough, the smallest thing Hagrid had held in his arms, and the most important. And now that same boy, 7 years old, had found Hagrid's name on a piece of paper and written, "Please write back if you can." He wanted to, more than he'd wanted almost anything since that night. Word came from Professor McGonagall before the afternoon was out. Don't respond. Dumbledore's instructions were clear. Hagrid folded the letter 8 times until it was a small square and put it in the inside breast pocket of his enormous coat. It stayed there all summer. At Spinner's End in Cokeworth, a letter arrived for Severus through the ordinary post. He knew what it was before he opened it. The handwriting of the address was a child's, unremarkable in itself, but the name on the envelope was Harry Potter, and that name was sufficient. He opened it. He read it once. He stood in the narrow front room with the letter in his hand and looked at the fireplace, which was cold in August, and then he set a match to the grate and put the letter in and watched it catch. Fire was cleaner than crumpling. He did not weep. The following morning he appeared at Hogwarts without being summoned and spoke to Dumbledore. He did not mention the letter. He came to ensure the man understood that Severus was aware and to hear what had been decided and to leave without objection. He had not come for permission. 2 streets from number 4 on Wisteria Walk, Arabella Figg held her copy at the kitchen window, with 2 of her cats turning circles at her feet. She knew what Harry had been doing at the letterbox each morning. She had watched him from this same window and understood the vigil before she understood the reason for it. She composed a reply in her head. "Harry, you are right that something is not being told to you." And then she did not write it down. She sent a note to Dumbledore by the means she'd been provided, and his reply came by evening. "Say nothing." She put it in the drawer with the others. She stood at her window that night and watched Harry in the small back garden of number 4, looking up at the sky with the expression of a child who has run out of other options. In a quiet house, at some remove from anything dangerous, Andromeda Tonks read Harry's letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and began a reply before her tea went cold. She got 3 sentences in before she stopped. She considered what question a 7-year-old would ask next after those 3 sentences. She traced the chain of questions to its end and thought about what that end looked like and about who might still be watching the kind of correspondence that moved between an address like hers and an address like his. She put the unsent reply in a drawer. She was not a coward. She simply understood, better than most, what careful cost. Elphias Doge sent a note to Dumbledore before he did anything else. Dumbledore's reply came back the same day. Don't respond. Doge didn't. That was how 14 mornings passed. On the 15th day, Harry was at the end of the hallway at 8:23 when 4 envelopes dropped through the slot. 3 were in the printed type of banks and utilities. 1 was handwritten. It was small, an ordinary off-white envelope, a little creased at one corner, as if it had been handled more than once before arriving. The handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven, the writing of someone who moved fast and had never resolved the question of legibility against efficiency. The return address gave a street number in a town Harry didn't recognize. Above the address was a name: R.J. Lupin. He stood very still. He had been watching for this for 14 days. And now that it was here, he found he needed a moment. He separated the 3 envelopes for Uncle Vernon from the one in his own hand, set the first group on the mat, and walked to his cupboard and shut the door behind him. He sat on his cot in the dim and held the envelope for a moment without opening it, the way you had to pause sometimes before a thing you couldn't undo, while outside in the hall, entirely unaware, Aunt Petunia moved toward the letter slot to collect what she expected to be the full morning post. He opened the letter before she reached the hall. The letter arrived on a morning when Lupin was already awake, which was not unusual in the week after the moon. He had been living in this room for 3 months, a spare, clean place in a town whose name he did not particularly associate with himself, rented furnished from a woman who asked no questions and expected no conversation, which suited him. There was a narrow bed he sat on rather than slept in, a table with a chair, a single window that looked onto a yard where somebody's washing moved in the early air. He had a kettle and a tin of tea, 3 books he'd already read, and a photograph in the inside pocket of his jacket. He was 27 years old. He did not look it. Light brown hair with grey already threaded through it, and a face that had started somewhere reasonable and then been renegotiated by years of something his body insisted on doing once a month, regardless of his preferences. His clothing was neat. He was careful about that, the way people are careful about things that stand between them and being looked at too closely, but worn past the point where careful could do much more. He was pale in the particular way of someone who has been ill for a long time and reached a settlement with the pallor. He had made his tea and was sitting at the table when he heard the post come through the slot downstairs, and the landlady sort it and leave his portion outside his door on the wooden chair in the hall, which was their arrangement. He brought it in without urgency. 3 envelopes, a form from a government office, something from a bank, and a folded piece of notebook paper in a child's handwriting, addressed to R.J. Lupin, and sent from 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He knew that address. He stood with the envelope in his hand and looked at the date stamp on the government form, the 31st of July, and then he sat back down. He read the letter slowly, twice. My name is Harry Potter. I am 7 years old today. I think you knew my parents. My aunt says they died in a car crash, but I don't think that's true. Please write back if you can. He put the letter down on the table and looked at the wall for a while. 7. On the 31st of July 1981, he had attended a birthday party for a 1-year-old in a house in Godric's Hollow, and James had held Harry on his shoulders for some portion of the afternoon, which Harry had apparently found baffling and then delightful, tipping forward to grab at his father's hair and shrieking with laughter when James tilted back to compensate. Lily had stood below them with her red hair catching the light and her arms up, ready to catch whoever fell first, laughing at both of them. That laugh of hers, the one that arrived slightly before she meant it to, that made everyone in the room want to know what was funny. 6 years ago. He put his hand to his inside pocket. The photograph was there, a folded square, 4 figures somewhere in 1979, laughing at something just off frame, and they moved when he looked at them in that way. Photographs moved for people like him. But he had learned to hold the image still for a moment against the motion, all 4 of them, and the laughter, and the moment held for as long as you could hold it. He did not take it out this morning. He knew what it said. He sat at the table for some time. He thought about Dumbledore's arrangement for the boy, the Dursleys, the blood protection, the ordinary life in Surrey, and Dumbledore's preference that Harry remain ignorant until some right time of Dumbledore's own determining. He thought about the fact that Dumbledore had issued no instruction to Lupin specifically on the matter. It would not have occurred to Dumbledore to name Lupin among the people the boy might locate. He thought about a 7-year-old at 4 Privet Drive who had found a scrap of paper with Lupin's name on it and written, "I think you knew my parents." He got out a piece of paper. He wrote carefully. Nothing that could not be read by a Muggle child. Nothing that named what should not be named to a 7-year-old who had already solved the car crash story without any help. He wrote several sentences and read them back and wrote 3 more. "Dear Harry, I did know your parents. Your father was one of my closest friends at school. He was very clever and very funny, and he had hair exactly like yours. It went every direction, and there was nothing to be done about it, and he eventually stopped trying. Your mother had red hair and green eyes, and the kind of laugh that made everything seem immediately better than it had a moment ago. They were not in a car crash. I cannot tell you more than that in a letter, because some things require a person and not a page. But I can tell you this. They loved you very much. I was at your first birthday, and your father had you on his shoulders, and neither of you could stop laughing, and your mother stood below both of you with her arms up, ready to catch whoever fell. I am very glad you wrote. He signed it, Remus. He wrote his address at the top. He sealed it, put on his jacket, walked to the post box before he could do anything as sensible as reconsider, and posted it. On the way back, he stopped on the pavement for a moment in the thin morning air. Then he went inside and made another cup of tea. 2 days later, Petunia and Vernon took Dudley to the Smeltings' summer fair, Smeltings being the school Vernon had attended and that Dudley was going to attend, the annual fair being a fixture. Harry was left at number 4 with an instruction to stay in his cupboard, which he did until the car turned off the road. He had expected to wait longer for a reply. He had been watching the post with less urgency since Lupin's first envelope arrived, understanding now that letters moved slowly and patience was part of it. What he had not expected was to find, when he opened the front door, that the morning's post was still on the mat. Petunia hadn't had time before the fair, and among it an envelope in cramped, familiar handwriting. He took it to his cupboard. He sat on his cot. He read it. He read it 6 times. Your father had hair exactly like yours. Your mother had a laugh that made everything seem immediately better. They loved you. I was there for your first birthday. He lay on his back with the letter on his chest and looked at the ceiling of the cupboard, which was the underside of the stairs, a shape he knew as well as he knew anything. He was looking at it differently than usual. The ceiling was the same. He seemed to have changed. He wrote back that night by torchlight. He had been composing the letter in his head for several days. Questions about his parents, about what was true, about what had actually happened to them, all the things he'd been carrying. He wrote 1 sentence, and then sat for a while with the torch aimed at the page and decided that 1 question was enough for now. What was my mum like? He wrote. He used the last 4 pence from the jar on the shelf. Lupin's reply came 4 days later, faster than Harry had expected, as though it had been written before the question finished arriving. It was 3 pages of notebook paper, front and back. It was entirely about Lily Evans. Lupin wrote about her the way someone wrote about a person they had studied carefully and grown to understand. Her gift for taking something difficult and locating its center. Not because things were easy for her, he made that clear, but because she paid a kind of attention most people never quite managed. The way her fury arrived when she encountered something unjust. Quietly first, in the set of her jaw and a particular stillness, and then very precisely, without waste, the thing she had decided to say. How she could see through a person in under a minute, and had never once used that ability to wound anyone. She looked through people, and then found something worth seeing instead. She was the kind of person, Lupin wrote, that you measured other things against afterwards. Harry read the 3 pages in the cupboard by torchlight. He read them a second time in the morning, by the light that came under the door. He did not put this letter with the others in the box on the shelf. He kept it under his mattress, where he could reach it in the dark. By September, the correspondence had established a rhythm, which was itself a new fact about the world, that Harry turned over at intervals the way you turned something in your pocket, not constantly, but to confirm it was still there. Letters came to the house, and some of them were his. Lupin wrote about his parents, in the language of someone choosing words carefully. He never named the school. He said at school, or when we were at school, or once, in an autumn letter, the school in Scotland, as though it existed, but did not need a name between them yet. He wrote about James, about his quickness, about the particular kind of cleverness that expresses itself as humour, about a game involving broom sports at which James had been exceptionally gifted, and the way James had been impossible to beat at anything once he'd decided he wasn't going to lose. He wrote about Lily's gift for chemistry, the way she could look at something that had no business working and make it work, and explain afterward not just what had happened, but why, in terms that reorganized how you thought about the subject entirely. He wrote about their friendship at that unnamed school in a way that made it sound like a country he'd loved and left. Harry learned to read between the words. It was a slow knowledge, the kind that accumulated without announcing itself. He read the letters in the cupboard, sometimes by torchlight after the house had gone quiet, and he would read a sentence and understand it plainly, and then reread it and find something underneath the plain meaning. Broom sports, the way Lupin wrote the phrase made it feel like a translation rather than a term. Chemistry. There was something in how he described Lily's gifts that suggested the word was an approximation, the closest available word for something that wanted a different word entirely. He was 7 years old, and he did not have the vocabulary to name what he was sensing. He had something else, the feeling of a gap, a space where the plain story and the true story did not quite meet. The car crash version of his parents had always had that quality, a weight and shape that didn't match the bag it was supposed to be in. The letters didn't fill the gap. They made it more precisely defined. In October, he wrote to ask why Lupin never named the school. The reply came in a week, because some conversations are better had in person than on paper, and because you are 7, and I would like you to be older before we have them. The things I am not telling you are things I will tell you. Not yet. But I will. Harry read this many times and decided it was the most honest thing an adult had ever said to him, which was not a high bar, but felt like one. In November he wrote the harder question. Why won't my aunt talk about my mum? He posted the letter on a Tuesday and spent the following 3 weeks watching the post with the same attention he'd given it in August. Lupin's letters came reliably, one every 10 days or so, reliable enough that Harry had learned when to expect them. 3 weeks with nothing was the longest gap since the correspondence had begun. It told him the question was one Lupin needed time with. The answer, when it came, was careful in the way all of Lupin's letters were careful, but more so. Your aunt and your mum had a falling out when they were young. It wasn't your mum's fault. Petunia was frightened of things she didn't understand, and that kind of fright has a way of not going away on its own. I think she misses your mum more than she lets herself know." Harry read that last sentence several times. He had not, until this moment, considered the possibility that Aunt Petunia missed anyone. He had less time to consider it than he might have, because the following week something happened. Petunia saw the handwriting on the envelope and knew what it was. She had been watching the post since September. In the sharp, sideways way, she watched things she didn't want to be forced to address. The handwriting was cramped and quick, and had appeared every 10 days or 2 weeks since the summer. She knew the rhythm of it by now. She had let those letters pass through the house with the silence she maintained about anything connected to Lily's world. The letter from Dumbledore in 1981. The things she had read in it. The arrangement she had made with herself about what to tell Vernon and what not to, which had been simpler than it sounded, because what she had decided not to tell Vernon was essentially all of it. She had her reasons. Explaining Dumbledore's letter would require explaining what she knew. What she knew was more than she had ever been prepared to say out loud, and what she had never been prepared to say out loud was that she had known more than she admitted and had said nothing, and that saying nothing about it had seemed simpler at the time and had only become less simple as time went on without her saying anything. This morning, Vernon had already left for Grunnings. Dudley was upstairs. The kitchen was hers. She stood at the counter with the envelope in her hands. Harry's name on the front, in the handwriting she had come to recognize. She turned it over. She was a tall woman with a long neck and a face her mother had once called equine, meaning it kindly, and the expression on that face as she stood holding the envelope was one she would have denied having if anyone had been there to see it. She did not open it for a full minute. Then she opened it. It was 2 pages in the cramped handwriting, careful, warm, the kind of letter written by someone who understood that a child reading it had never known the subject. She read about chemistry and broom sports. She read the name of a school that was never quite named. She read a description of Lily at school that was accurate in the particular way that only people who had known Lily could be accurate. The laugh that arrived before she meant it to, the fury that came quietly, the way she made difficult things look simple without making you feel slow for having found them difficult. Petunia read it twice. Then she burned it in the kitchen sink. She ran the tap afterward and watched the ash go down. She said nothing to Harry. She said nothing to Vernon. She stood at the kitchen window for some time, looking at the garden, which was in need of attention, which she would attend to presently, which was not what she was thinking about. The following week, Lupin's next letter arrived, and it referenced, in passing, something Harry had apparently said in response to the letter about Petunia. Except Harry had said no such thing, because he had not received the letter that was being responded to, because the letter that was being responded to did not exist. He read the new letter 3 times, looking for the thing Lupin seemed to be answering and couldn't find it. Then he understood. He wrote back, "I don't think I received your last letter. I sent a reply to the one about Petunia, but I haven't heard from you since, and your new letter seems to be answering something I didn't write. Did you get mine?" Lupin's response came quickly. "I don't believe I did." He asked Harry to send again whatever he had meant to say. Harry did. The correspondence resumed, and they did not discuss the gap directly. Harry noted it. He was 7 years old and nearly 8, and he was learning how the world worked, that there were spaces between himself and the people who paid attention to him, and that other people could occupy those spaces without his knowing. He filed this away with the other things he was accumulating that autumn and winter, about his parents, about the gaps in what he'd been told, about what broom sports and chemistry meant when Remus Lupin wrote them. and he kept it under the mattress with the first letter, and he kept it in his head where it settled in beside the rest. Spring came to little whinging in gradual installments. First the quality of light changing, then the front gardens of Privet Drive beginning their seasonal competition, then the Saturday afternoons that lasted long enough to require something to do in them. The something that Harry did on approximately one Saturday in 4 was to be taken to Mrs. Figg's on Wisteria Walk, 2 streets over, which was not a prospect he had ever greeted with enthusiasm, and which nothing had changed to make better. He had found, since the autumn, that he was better at deciding which things to accept without complaint. Complaint didn't help. You prioritized. Mrs. Figg's house smelled of cats, and something baked a long time ago. The photographs of her cats were on every available surface. Mr. Tibbles, Mr. Paws, Tufty, Snowy, and several others whose names Harry had learned through repetition across many Saturday afternoons. The biscuits she offered were the specific biscuits that left you feeling somehow worse than if you'd eaten nothing. The sofas were covered in cat hair. Mrs. Figg herself was a small, white-haired woman in a fluffy cardigan, with eyes like her cat's eyes, bright, unhurried, giving nothing away. She looked at Harry when Petunia left him on the doorstep, and something in her expression shifted. Not an expression exactly, more the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating against expectation. She brought him in. She offered the biscuits. She sat in her chair with Mr. Tibbles in her lap and watched. Harry took a biscuit and sat. He had been coming to this house since he was old enough to be left somewhere, which in the Dursleys' estimation had been quite early. He ate the biscuit with the focused patience of someone tolerating it for the sake of form. Mrs. Figg watched him do this. She had been watching Harry Potter for years. It was her work, the specific, patient, undemonstrative watching of someone placed in a position by a person whose expectations she did not violate. In 7 years she had watched him come through this door more times than she could count, and the version of Harry who came through the door had always been the same. A thin child in clothes that had belonged to a larger boy. A child who held himself slightly inward, slightly minimized, too quiet in the way that children were too quiet when they had learned that being too loud didn't help. She had composed replies to his letter last August, and not sent them. She had watched him check the post from her kitchen window. She had received Dumbledore's instruction. Say nothing. She had kept it. But this child, sitting across from her and eating a biscuit with the focused patience of someone tolerating it rather than enjoying it, this child was different. The difference was not physical. He was still thin, still wearing clothes that were plainly Dudley's cast-offs, still with his glasses sitting slightly askew on his face and the lightning bolt scar visible above his right eye. But he was not. She searched for the word and found it. Contracted. He had always been contracted, the way small animals contracted, taking up less space than they needed, so as not to attract attention. He was not contracted now. He was simply sitting. He was doing the courtesy of sitting quietly in her living room while she looked at him, and he was not afraid of the room. She knew what that was. She had always known what that was, and she had never seen it in Harry before. And it was this. Someone had been paying attention to him, not watching him, the way she watched him, the way the Dursleys monitored him. Paying attention, which was different, which was the difference between a person who is surveilled and a person who is known. She let him finish the biscuit, and then asked him, in the mild way she asked things, what he had been reading lately. Harry named a book from school. She asked what else. He considered. "My friend Remus sends me books sometimes," he said, and she watched him notice he had said it, and look at his biscuit. "My friend Remus." Mrs. Figg did not react. This was a skill she had spent several years perfecting. She asked, in the same mild tone, whether that was a friend from school. Harry said not exactly. She asked if Remus lived nearby. Harry said no, not nearby. She let the subject close and moved to the cats, and Harry answered her questions about Mr. Tibbles with the polite cooperation of a child who had been raised to be courteous to adults, even when he had nothing particular to say to them. Petunia collected him at 4. Mrs. Figg stood at her front door and watched the car reverse out of the drive, and then stood for a moment in the spring afternoon, not thinking about anything specific, which was not the same as not thinking. She went inside. She sat in her chair. She had been given instructions. She had kept them for 8 months without incident, without question, without asking herself too closely whether keeping them was the right thing to do. The question had always seemed settled. Dumbledore's instructions were Dumbledore's instructions, and his reasons were good ones, and hers was not to examine them. She had examined them anyway, privately, in the way she examined everything privately. She had found them defensible. She had kept them. But she had never, in all of it, watched Harry come through her door and not been the inward, minimized child she knew from 7 years of Saturday afternoons. She had never had to sit across from a child who had come back from somewhere and decided to be seen. She sent her report that evening, through the means Dumbledore had provided for that purpose. She described what she had observed. The change in Harry, the quality of the change, what it meant when a child who had been treated as invisible started to become legible to himself. She named the name the boy had let slip. She wrote, "I believe Harry has been in correspondence with Remus Lupin since August. I believe the correspondence is ongoing. I am writing to inform you and to ask what you would like me to do." She had not asked that before. She asked now because she was not entirely certain she would follow the answer, and she thought Dumbledore should know that. In his office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore read Mrs. Figg's note by the afternoon light from the high windows, and then sat with it for a while without putting it down. He had known since August that letters had been sent. Snape had come to him, McGonagall, Hagrid. Figg had sent her note. He had known that Harry had written to 9 people, and at most of those people the letter had produced the correct outcome. It had been filed or burned, and the senders had come to him, and he had told them what to do. He had known that Lupin had received one. He had waited. He had waited because Lupin was not in his employ and could not be directed, and because he had assumed, he used the word to himself with the exactness he tried to apply to his own errors, he had assumed that Lupin would behave as the others had. Because Lupin understood the plan. Because Lupin was careful and methodical, and had made a study of discretion that put many more formally trained people to shame. He had assumed Lupin would recognize the wisdom of the arrangement and defer to it. 8 months. He thought about the name in Mrs. Figg's careful handwriting. My friend Remus. He thought about a 7-year-old who had described Lupin as a friend, not as someone he wrote to, not as a man who knew his parents, but as a friend, and about what that word meant when it came from a child who had been without one. He thought about what 8 months of letters between a lonely child and a grieving man had built, quietly, in the ordinary post, while he had been waiting for it to end on its own. It had not ended. He put Mrs. Figg's note in the drawer where he kept things that required action, and the following morning he set out to find Remus Lupin. The knock came in the early afternoon, while Lupin was at the table with a book he wasn't reading. He had been expecting it, in the general way he had learned to expect things that were inevitable. Not today specifically, not this week, but sometime. When he opened the door to find Albus Dumbledore on the landing of a rented house in an unremarkable town, holding a packet of tea biscuits and looking as though he'd arrived for a pleasant visit, Lupin felt the specific quiet of a thing he'd been waiting for. "Remus," Dumbledore said, "I hope I haven't called at a difficult time." He had not been invited in. He came in anyway, with the particular ease of a very old man who has never had to ask permission for anything. He set the biscuits on the table as though this were an arrangement they had agreed on in advance. He sat down. Lupin shut the door. He sat across the table from Albus Dumbledore, who was approximately 107, and looked, as he always did, as though the years sat well on him, which Lupin had always found faintly unreasonable. "You know why I'm here," Dumbledore said. It wasn't a question. "I think I might," Lupin said. Dumbledore's half-moon spectacles caught the afternoon light. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man composing something he has already composed, giving it a moment to settle into the right order. Then he said, "You have been writing to Harry." "Yes, since last July. Since the 31st of July. Lupin paused. "Since his birthday." Dumbledore looked at him over his spectacles. "I know what day it was." He folded his hands on the table. "I should tell you that I have known since August that letters were sent. I waited to see whether the correspondence would resolve itself. It hasn't." "No," Dumbledore agreed. "It has not." He was quiet for a moment. "What I would like you to understand, Remus, is what I am protecting." He explained it then, calmly, without rushing, the way he explained things that he had thought about for a long time and believed to be true. The blood protection, what Lily's sacrifice had built, how it worked, what it required. It required Harry at Privet Drive, calling it home, until the age of 17. It required the Dursley arrangement to remain intact. Not merely physically, the enchantment was bound to something deeper than proximity, to the state of Harry belonging there, however unhappily, however imperfectly, as the child of that household. It was the most powerful protection Dumbledore knew how to provide, and he had built it at the cost of a great deal that was not his to spend. He did not say that last part. Lupin was quiet throughout this. He sat with his hands around the cup of tea he had made, because he had made tea despite everything, because making tea was something to do with his hands. "I understand the plan," he said, when Dumbledore was finished. "I have understood it. I'm not writing to Harry because I don't understand the plan." He looked at the window. "I'm writing to him because I have been reading his letters for 8 months. Remus, he writes on school notebook paper," Lupin said. "The kind you buy at Woolworth's for 14 pence. He uses the back pages first, because he wants to save the front pages for letters. He plans what he is going to say before he says it." He paused. "He writes the way a child writes, when he has learned that what he says might not be wanted. He asks one question per letter. 1. Because he is afraid that asking more than one at once might make me stop." Dumbledore said nothing. "That is what 8 years in that house has produced," Lupin said. "A child who rations his questions, a child who has learned to need very little because needing things didn't help him." He set the cup down. "The correspondence has not endangered him. He writes nothing specific. I write nothing that would trouble a muggle reading the post. He is a 7-year-old boy who has a pen friend, and the pen friend tells him things about his parents, and this is, as far as I can determine, the only source in his life of information about who he comes from. I am not disputing what the correspondence has given him," Dumbledore said. He said this with a gentleness that was genuine rather than strategic, which made it harder. "I am asking you to consider what it will cost." He leaned forward slightly. If Vernon Dursley finds out that his nephew is receiving letters from someone connected to Lily Potter's world, the arrangement is disrupted. The blood protection is not only about location, it is about Harry's position in that home. If the Dursleys decide that Harry's presence is bringing things they cannot control into their lives, the situation becomes unstable, and what Lily built fails, and I cannot rebuild it. I know how old he is, Lupin said. Then you understand what I'm asking. Lupin was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke carefully, in the voice of someone who wants to be wrong about what he is about to say, and isn't. So the argument is that Harry must be kept unhappy so that the people who are mistreating him will continue to mistreat him in the correct house. Dumbledore did not say anything. That is the argument, Lupin said. Not an accusation, a recognition. Because if he is too content, if the Dursleys become too aware of him, if they notice he is receiving attention from the outside, if they feel they are losing control of how he is managed, the arrangement could break. So he should remain invisible and miserable and without anyone, so that they don't look at him too closely. It is not the goal, Dumbledore said quietly. It is a constraint. There is a woman on Wisteria Walk, Lupin said, who was specifically instructed to keep her afternoons with him dull, to ensure that the Dursleys would not feel Harry was too happy with her. Harry mentioned this in a letter, as though it were entirely normal. He thinks it is normal. He has arranged his expectations around a version of ordinary that doesn't include being wanted. Dumbledore said, Remus. He said it in a way that could mean many things, and Lupin recognized the one it meant here. I know. A silence settled. I cannot compel you, Dumbledore said at last. He said this without resentment. I have no authority over what you do with your own correspondence. I am asking you, as someone who loved James and Lily, to consider whether what you are building with this child is worth the risk to what she died to protect. Lupin looked at the window for a moment. The washing in the yard below moved in the spring air. James would have hated this, he said. Dumbledore did not disagree. He sat very still for a moment, his old hands quiet on the table, his expression the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has learned to carry it without showing where it is heaviest. James trusted me, he said finally, as did Lily. I know, Lupin said. I know they did. He stood, which was not quite an invitation for Dumbledore to leave, but was not quite not one either. I'll think about it. Dumbledore rose. He was very tall, even old, even with the years in him. He took the packet of biscuits from the table, an odd gesture, retrieving them, and then seemed to reconsider and left them there. He went to the door. At the door he paused. He is safer not knowing, he said. That is the truth of it. Whatever else is also true. Lupin didn't answer. Dumbledore left. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs diminished and was gone. The front door of the house opened and closed. Lupin stood at the window and watched the street below until the tall figure disappeared around the corner, and then stood there a little longer. He sat back down at the table. He sat with the packet of biscuits and the 2 cups of tea, one empty, one still half full, and the afternoon light moving across the table. And he sat in the particular quiet of a room where a conversation has just ended, and what it decided has not yet been named. After a long time, he reached for a sheet of paper. He wrote. He wrote about something mundane first, a book he thought Harry might like, something about birds and navigation, which had nothing to do with anything, except that it was true, and Harry collected true things the way some children collected objects. He wrote about the spring, Then at the end he wrote, "I should tell you that I intend to keep writing to you. I am telling you this because I want you to know it is a decision rather than an assumption, and that the decision is not one I made carelessly. I'm going to keep writing to you." He sealed the letter. He put it in his jacket pocket for the post box in the morning. He sat for a while longer in the room that still held the shape of the conversation, and then he made a fresh cup of tea and opened the book he hadn't been reading, and read it. Something changed in Lupin's letters in June. Harry had been reading them long enough to know the style. Efficient, warm, saying what needed saying without a great deal of extra. There was a rhythm to how Lupin followed a thought past its first destination, a way his sentences wandered when he was comfortable. The June letter was short in a new way, warm and present, but shorter, and the sentences that usually wandered didn't. Lupin was choosing his words with a care that hadn't been there in March. Harry, who had been doing the same thing in his own letters for a year, recognized the practice from the inside. He waited a few days before asking. He'd learned, from Lupin's example, that the question you asked shaped the kind of answer you could get. He wrote, "Your last letters feel different. Not worse. Different. Did something happen? You don't have to say what." He posted it from the letterbox at the end of the road, his system since April, when Petunia had started paying attention to the one near the house. Lupin's reply came in 8 days, faster than usual, and 2 pages, longer than the June letters. He wrote about James first, about broom sports at school, and James's particular joy in them, the kind of enjoyment that was contagious in the way that some people's pleasure was. He wrote about James's friendship with another boy at school, a boy he called by his surname, Black, and how some friendships were structural, load-bearing, the kind you built the rest of your life around. He was mid-sentence, something about Black and a prank involving a geography classroom, when the paragraph ended. Below it, in slightly different ink, as though he'd returned to the letter later. "I'll tell you more about Sirius when you're older. There are some things that need a different kind of telling." Harry read the postscript several times. The other things Lupin wasn't saying yet all had a similar quality. Waiting, not withheld. This one felt different. He'd started to say it, and stopped. He wrote back about school and didn't ask again. On the 31st of July, he turned 8. The Dursleys acknowledged this the way they acknowledged most things related to Harry, which was by not acknowledging it. Harry had anticipated this, which did not make it nothing, but which meant he had something to do with the day that was separate from what the day was failing to be. He watched the post. The postman came at 8:32. 3 envelopes in the printed type of utilities and banks. One small, slightly lumpy, handwritten. He took it to his cupboard. Inside was a card, hand-drawn, folded. Lupin had drawn something on the front that was either a dog or a very patient attempt at one. The drawing had a quality of affection in it, the kind of drawing made by someone who was trying rather than someone who was good. He opened it. "Happy birthday, Harry. You are 8. When I was 8, I had a dog. I called him Mooney." Below that, "I hope your day is better than most." Harry sat with the card for a while. Mooney. He turned the word over. Dogs had names like Rex or Patch, names that sounded like instructions. Mooney was the sort of name you gave something you loved and didn't expect to be understood by anyone else. He put the card under his mattress, separate from the letters, which seemed right. He spent the rest of his birthday thinking about a man who had a dog named Mooney when he was 8. The birthday card was the first thing sent to him that was not a letter. Deliberately not a letter, he thought. Deliberately a card. As though someone had thought about what a birthday required and decided to provide it in the form that seemed most right. The letters Petunia had been intercepting since spring were not a secret from Vernon, so much as a fact she had not chosen to raise. There was a distinction there, and she knew it mattered. She monitored the post in the sideways way. She managed things she didn't want to confront directly. When the cramped handwriting appeared, she removed the envelope, and the letter became ash in the kitchen sink, and that was the end of it. She had been doing this since the autumn. She did not think of it as withholding. In August, Vernon intercepted 2 before she did. He brought them to her at breakfast, both unopened, with the expression he wore when something had placed itself outside his control without permission. She looked at the handwriting, and nothing in her face changed, which was itself the signal, the very thing Vernon was watching for. He saw her not react, and drew the correct conclusion. He was furious in the low, contained way that was harder to manage than the other way. He wanted to know who the letters were from. She said she didn't know, which was true in the specific sense that she knew what the letters were, not who had sent them. He wanted to know how long this had been happening. She said she hadn't been monitoring Harry's post. This was not true, but she said it without difficulty. That afternoon he searched Harry's cupboard, the shelf, the box, the arrangement of 2 large clothes. He found a torch, a library book, 2 pencils. No letters. The absence bothered him more than finding them would have done, because it meant Harry had been expecting to be searched, and had been cleverer about it than Vernon had accounted for. He told Harry that evening the letters stopped. Harry said yes, Uncle Vernon, with the specific flatness he used when no response was the correct response. Vernon was not satisfied, which was accurate. That night, Harry wrote in the dark by torchlight. My uncle found out about our letters. He might try to stop them. He searched my room, but I'd already moved everything. I don't know what to do if he starts watching the post more. He posted it the next morning from the end-of-road letterbox on his way to return a library book. Lupin's reply arrived in 5 days. A new record. It was practical and warm, which was the tone Lupin used for things that required both. Use the letterbox at the end of your road, not the one near the house. I think you're already doing this. If they take a letter before you can read it, don't react when it's missing. The reaction is what they're looking for, not the letter. Below that, if things become too difficult at Privet Drive, there is another option. I believe you know the woman on Wisteria Walk, 2 streets over. Her name is Mrs. Figg. I can send letters there instead, if you would like, and she could pass them to you when you visit. You would need to ask her. She may say no, but I don't think she will. Harry read this twice. He thought about Mrs. Figg, her cat photographs, her bad biscuits, the bright, unhurried quality of her eyes, and about what it meant that Lupin knew to suggest her. The specificity of the suggestion. How you suggested a thing when you were reasonably certain about it. He wrote back, I'll ask her. Then, because it had been sitting in him all summer. What was Mooney? Lupin's reply came back in 10 days. 1 sentence. Mooney was a name I gave something that needed one, and I'll explain that properly too when there's more room than a letter. Harry folded it and put it with the card. By the end of summer, he had a fairly complete, private catalogue of the things Lupin was saving for later. Not absences, placements. Things set aside with the intention of returning. Not yet, he had come to understand, was not the same as no, and the difference was important. He kept this distinction in his head, along with the other things the letters had taught him. That what you didn't say could be as careful as what you said. That care itself was a form of presence. and that a person who told you "I'll explain that properly" was a different thing than a person who said nothing at all. He was 8 years old, and he was beginning to understand the difference between the two. The letter arrived in September with a question in it that Harry had not expected. Lupin wrote that he would be passing through the south of England on some business he didn't specify, work of a kind Harry had come to understand was intermittent and difficult to explain, and asked whether Harry might like to meet him at the corner of his road one morning, if his aunt and uncle agreed. He wrote, "I should tell you that I look rather older than I am, and shabbier than you might expect from someone who was James Potter's friend. I want you to know this in advance, so that it doesn't seem strange when you see me." Harry read this several times. Not an apology, not quite a warning. Information, offered precisely. Lupin had gotten good at that in 2 years, telling Harry things in advance that other adults thought children would rather not know. He went to the kitchen after dinner and asked Aunt Petunia if a friend of his parents could come by the house. Petunia was at the sink. She stilled, a slight pause in the motion of her hands under the tap, before she said she didn't think that would be a good idea. Vernon said no from the sitting room without looking up from the television. Harry said yes, Uncle Vernon, and went upstairs. What stayed with him was Petunia's pause. Vernon's no was what it always was. But Petunia had stopped, hands under the running water, and said nothing at all before she said the other thing. He wrote back the following day. "My aunt and uncle said no. But if you wanted, I could meet you at the end of my road. Tuesday morning, I don't have school. If that's too much trouble, then it's all right." He posted it at the end of road letterbox and waited. Lupin's reply came back in 4 days. "Tuesday is fine. I'll be at the corner of your road at 9. You'll know me by the grey in the hair." On Tuesday morning in October, Harry told Aunt Petunia he was going for a walk. She didn't answer, which was her variety of permission for things she'd decided not to examine. He walked down Privet Drive in the thin October air and turned left at the end of the road. There was a man at the corner. Harry saw him before the man saw him. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking down the road with the patient stillness of someone comfortable waiting, not nervous, just present. He was tall, or had been. He stood slightly in the way of someone who had once stood straighter. His jacket was dark and worn past the point where worn was a style choice. His hair was light brown, with grey threaded through it heavily enough to change the balance, and he was pale in a way Harry had come to recognize from the letters, the paleness of someone who got ill regularly and had a particular relationship with recovery. He looked up and saw Harry. Something happened in his face that Harry couldn't name precisely. Not surprise. He'd known Harry was coming. Something more like a bracing, a split second of a person holding something very still before it moved. "Harry," he said. "Remus," Harry said, because that was the name. Lupin looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You look like your father." "People say that. I expect they do." He said this quietly, as though to himself. Then, "There's a wall along here, by the park, unless you'd rather walk." "The wall's fine," Harry said. They sat on the low wall along the edge of the small park, 2 streets over. In October it had a quality of being between things. The trees not quite finished turning, the light clear and cool. They talked about the letters first, which was natural. Lupin asked about school with genuine interest. Harry answered honestly, which was easier than he'd expected. He had been slightly afraid that Lupin in person would require a different Harry than the one who wrote letters, a more presentable version. But Lupin was exactly as he was in the letters, precise and warm, not requiring anything Harry didn't have. They talked about James. Lupin talked differently about James in person than in letters, less careful, more direct. He told Harry about James at school, a confidence that was not arrogance, because it never came at anyone's expense. A way of being. Lupin paused, choosing the word, relentless, about things that interested him and about people he'd decided to care about. "Did he know about me?" Harry said. "Before." "Yes," Lupin said. "He talked about you. The broom sports thing, mostly." A pause. "He wanted to take you to a match when you were old enough to understand it." Harry sat with this and looked at the park. After a while, Lupin reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a photograph. He held it for a moment before passing it over, a small square, slightly creased at one corner, the kind of photograph that had been kept somewhere close for a long time. Harry took it. He had seen photographs of people before. He understood photographs, but the people in this one were moving. His father was holding him, a small Harry, not quite a year-old Harry, up on his shoulders, and James was laughing at something off to one side, and the small Harry was grabbing at his father's hair and tilting dangerously forward with the unconcerned faith of a very young child. His mother was in the lower part of the frame, her arms up. Harry saw the bright red of her hair, the green of her eyes. And she was laughing, and she wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at both of them, and the people in the photograph moved and moved in their small loop. And it didn't stop. He sat very still. He did not ask about the moving. It happened, and he held the photograph, and the figures moved, and something in his chest did something he didn't have a word for. He had known his parents from letters, described, careful, chosen. Now he was looking at them. The distance between the two kinds of knowing was larger than he had realized. "Is that me?" he said. It was not quite a question. "You're a year old," Lupin said. "The 31st of July, 1981. Your father's been doing that for an hour. He's going to give himself a back injury." Harry looked at the photograph for a long time. The small Harry up on his father's shoulders, tilting forward, delighted. He handed it back carefully. "You can keep it," Lupin said, "if you'd like. I have others." Harry looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I'd like you to have it." Harry put it in his jacket pocket. They sat for a while in the quiet after that. The park was empty, the morning air moving slightly, the trees at the edge of their last color. "Are you all right?" Harry said after a while. "You look like you've been ill." Lupin was quiet for a moment. "I get ill sometimes," he said. "Every month or so. I'm all right between times." "Is it catching?" "No." "Okay," Harry said. The hour passed the way certain hours passed, more inside it than the number suggested. They talked about Lily, a specific argument she'd had at school that Lupin still thought she'd been right about, the way she made difficult things seem simple without making you feel slow for finding them difficult. Lupin told these things the way he wrote them, and Harry listened. At 10:10, Lupin said he should be going. They stood from the wall. Harry was 9 years old and came to approximately Lupin's shoulder. Lupin looked at him with the expression Harry had been watching develop across the morning, the look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has set it down and found it different from what he expected. "Same time next year?" Lupin said. "Yes," Harry said, without having to think about it. Mrs. Figg, behind the curtain of her front window on Wisteria Walk, watched from 9:05. She watched them sit on the wall, watched the photograph change hands, watched them talk. She wrote to Dumbledore that evening, and did not recommend an intervention, which was itself a kind of recommendation. Harry walked back up Privet Drive at 10:30. Petunia was in the front garden, doing something with the roses that didn't require as much attention as she was giving them. She heard the gate and looked up. She looked at his face. She had been looking at Harry's face for 9 years, the glasses slightly askew, the scar, the expression usually arranged into something carefully unremarkable. She knew that expression the way she knew her own hallway. What she saw now was not that expression. It was open, steady in the way of someone who has received something they needed and found it real. She had seen that look before. Not on Harry, never on Harry. On Lily's face, those first summers home from school, when Lily had come through the door with something bright and particular that Petunia hadn't been given access to. The look on Lily's face had been exactly this. Not triumph, not exclusion. Fullness. Of a kind Petunia didn't know how to touch. She went very still with the garden shears in her hands. Harry went past her into the house. She stood in the garden alone and did not call after him. Harry had been thinking about the monthly illness since October. He had a framework for things he didn't understand. Find the closest available word and follow it until it stopped fitting. Then find the next closest word. He'd used this system on broom sports and chemistry and the school in Scotland, and he'd gotten somewhere with all of them. Not the full answer, but the shape of where the full answer lived. He tried it now with every month or so, and I'm all right between times, and it's not catching. In November he went to the school library and looked through the medical section, which was one long shelf of encyclopedias with coloured spines. He tried fever, which gave him something general and useless. He tried illness, which gave him similar. He tried cycles and found the wrong kind. He looked up malaria, because he remembered from geography that it came in recurring waves. But malaria required mosquitoes and tropical temperatures, and neither of those applied. He looked up lupus without knowing why the word had occurred to him, and found that lupus was a skin disease of a different kind from anything he was looking for. He stood in the school library aisle with the encyclopedia open, and understood he was missing a word. The thing he was looking for existed. Lupin had confirmed it, calmly and without embarrassment, in 6 words. But whatever word named it was not in the medical section of a primary school library in Surrey. He would have to wait for the word to arrive. He filed this under things Lupin will explain when there's more room, and walked back to class. The letters continued through winter. Lupin wrote, in December, about what it had been like to be good at lessons when his best friends teased him for it. Not meanly, he clarified, in the way that teasing was sometimes a way of saying, "I notice you." He wrote about James and the others sitting in the back of the classroom, producing small-scale chaos, while Lupin took notes, and about the particular quality of being bad at something you love and watching your friend do it without effort, which turned out to be a thing you could make your peace with if the friend was the right kind of friend. He wrote about choosing to find it funny, and how that turned out to be the right choice. Harry wrote back about his own school, about a maths teacher who was good at explaining things, about a boy in his class who was funny in the way that made everyone feel better, rather than someone's expense, about what it was like to eat lunch alone in the way that was not quite bullying and not quite loneliness, but something between the two. He posted these letters at the end of road box. He kept Lupin's letters in the back of his winter coat, in the inside pocket, which he had determined was the safest place, because Vernon never handled his clothes. In January, Vernon found the old letters. Harry came home from school on a Tuesday, and the kitchen was wrong before he could see why. Vernon was standing at the kitchen counter, not at the table, not in the sitting room, standing with his arms crossed in the specific way of a man who has been waiting and has had time to build himself up. On the counter in front of him were 11 envelopes. They were the ones Harry had kept in the shoebox under his cot from the early months of the correspondence, From before, he'd understood the importance of the inside coat pocket. He had thought the shoebox was well enough hidden. He had been wrong. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and understood all of this, and then he went in and set his school bag down. Vernon said who sent these. Not a question. Harry said a friend, because that was accurate and short. Vernon said he hadn't asked what they were, he'd asked who sent them. Harry looked at him and said a friend of my parents. He watched Vernon process this and knew the moment it arrived. The letters burned in the kitchen sink while Harry stood and watched. Vernon did not do it with drama. He was efficient about it, the same way he was efficient about things he found distasteful. He ran the tap afterward. He told Harry this stopped now, that whatever contact Harry was maintaining with whatever person this was had ended today, and that if another letter arrived in this house, Harry could expect consequences he would find instructive. Harry said yes, Uncle Vernon. Vernon sent him upstairs. Harry went. He lay on his cot in the cupboard and looked at the underside of the stairs and thought carefully about what he was going to do. The following morning, Vernon's car left the drive at 7:45. Harry counted to 100, then got up, put on his school uniform, and left the house. He walked down Privet Drive to the letterbox at the end of the road. He was carrying a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket that he had written in the dark the night before, by torchlight. He posted it and walked to school. The letter said, "My uncle found the letters I'd kept. He burned them. He doesn't know about this one, but he'll be watching now. I thought you should know. I'm all right." Below that he had written, "I'm still going to write to you." Lupin's reply did not come to Privet Drive. It came instead to Wisteria Walk, 2 streets over, in a plain envelope addressed to A. Figg in the cramped, familiar handwriting. On the Saturday, Harry was brought for a babysitting afternoon. Mrs. Figg's house was the same as it always was. Cat photographs on every surface. The smell of something baked at some earlier point in the day. Mr. Tibbles asleep on the back of the sofa. She offered him the biscuits that left you feeling worse than if you'd eaten nothing. He ate one and sat. After 20 minutes, she went to the kitchen. He heard the sound of her moving around, the kettle, the cupboard. When she came back, she had 2 cups of tea and the biscuits on a plate and a plain white envelope, which she set on the seat cushion between them as though it were a natural part of the arrangement. He looked at it. He looked at her. Her expression was the expression he had seen on her face across 8 years of Saturday afternoons. Mild, slightly unfocused, the look of a woman whose main interlocutors were her cats and who had made her peace with this. Then she looked at him. For 1 second, the expression was not that expression. She looked at him the way a person looked at something they knew the complete story of and had been keeping to themselves. It was not unkind. It was not apologetic. It was simply full. The look of someone who had been standing at the edge of a very large thing for a very long time and could not come any further in, but could confirm that the large thing was real. Then she said, "I've got a new kitten. She's upstairs. I'll introduce you when she's less skittish." She turned back to her tea. Harry picked up the envelope. He read the letter in the back bedroom, while Mrs. Figg made more tea. Lupin wrote that he had been expecting something like this, that it was all right, that the new arrangement was better anyway. Letters to a neutral address, nothing to find at Privet Drive. He wrote, "I'm not going anywhere." And then, below that, "Tell Mrs. Figg I said hello." Harry sat on the edge of the bed in the back bedroom of the house on Wisteria Walk and thought about this. He had been building something, for 2.5 years, that he had thought was between him and Lupin. He was beginning to understand it was larger than that. There were people at the edges of it. Mrs. Figg with her look that lasted 1 second, Lupin knowing her name and address, and that she was the right person to ask. People who knew his parents' world and had been around him, watching, for years. He didn't ask Mrs. Figg about it when he went back downstairs. She didn't offer. She introduced him to the kitten, who was grey and suspicious and had to be coaxed down from the wardrobe, and Harry sat on the floor and held out his hand and let the kitten decide. They had tea. She showed him a photograph of Mr. Tibbles as a kitten, which looked remarkably similar to the new kitten. When Petunia collected him at 4, Harry said, "Thank you, Mrs. Figg." She said, "Come again, dear," in the mild voice. But she held the door a moment longer than usual after Petunia turned toward the car, and Harry, looking back, saw the same thing he'd seen for 1 second earlier that afternoon. The other face beneath the face she showed. He filed it with the rest of the things he was keeping track of. In the summer of 1990, Harry turned 10, and the birthday card from Lupin arrived at Mrs. Figg's, and Harry read it on the walk home from Wisteria Walk, with his hand over the outside of his jacket pocket, feeling the paper through the fabric. 3 years of correspondence. He could have told you how Lupin's handwriting changed when he was writing fast versus when he was being careful. He could have told you that Lupin started sentences over when something wasn't quite right, crossing the first attempt with a single line and beginning again, and that the restarted sentences were almost always better. He knew how Lupin thought about James, not with the careful phrasing of letters written to a child, but with the directness of a man talking about someone he still missed in the present tense. He knew Lupin got ill every month and had made a kind of arrangement with this fact, the way you arranged yourself around a limitation that was not going away. He knew the things Lupin was saving to tell him, and he knew, roughly, that there were a few things Lupin couldn't tell him, which was different. He was 10 years old. He thought something was going to happen, in the way that you felt a change in barometric pressure before understanding it was weather. He didn't know yet what to call it. In a rented room in a town Harry had never seen, Remus Lupin sat at a table with a blank sheet of paper and a cup of tea that had gone cold while he was thinking. He was 30 years old. He had been writing to Harry for 3 years, through 5 addresses, through Mrs. Figg's biscuit-scented relay point, through Vernon Dursley's interference and the adjustments that required. He had been writing to a child who had written back with increasing precision and care, and who had asked, last spring, why Lupin sometimes seemed to be saying something underneath what he was saying. "Because sometimes I am," Lupin had written back. "You'll understand why, eventually." The thing he knew that Harry didn't was this. In approximately 1 year, possibly in the summer, possibly in early autumn, a letter would arrive at Forper Privet Drive with an unusual seal and an unusual address, and after that letter, the arrangement Harry had built his life around would change. Lupin could not say any of this. He could not name what the letter was, or who would come after it, or what the school in Scotland actually was, or why Harry's name was known to everyone in a world Harry had never been allowed to understand. He could say other things. He could say the things that would still be true after the letter arrived. He could say the things Harry would need to have heard before the world, that world, their world, opened for him. He picked up his pen. The letter he wrote that August was about what made a person themselves. Not their name, he wrote, which was given and not chosen. Not their reputation, which was assigned by others and reflected their needs as much as your reality. Not who their parents were, though he knew this one would land differently for Harry than for most children. Not who your parents were, because you did not choose them, and you are not a continuation of them, whatever anyone might tell you about the weight of it. What made a person themselves, Lupin wrote, was the choices they made in the small moments when no one was watching. Not the large ones. The large choices were usually obvious, and you could be brave or cowardly in them with approximately equal ease. The small ones, whether you told the truth when a lie was easier and no one would know, whether you noticed someone being left out and did something about it, whether, when you were given every reason to become the thing that had been done to you, you chose differently. He folded this carefully and sent it to Wisteria Walk. The autumn correspondence had a different quality than anything before it. Harry wrote about school, which was ordinary, and about a teacher who had said something unkind in front of the class, which was also ordinary. He wrote about a book he was reading about Arctic exploration, about the specific problem of navigating when magnetic north and true north were different, and about how you had to know which kind of north your compass was giving you in order to trust it. He wrote about wanting to know the difference. Lupin wrote back, "The compass is always more trustworthy than the needle, by which I mean the instrument you've built in yourself is more reliable than the one the world hands you. You've been doing this for years. You know how." In November, Harry wrote, "I think something is going to happen soon. I don't know what. But I can feel it, the way you can feel a change in the air before you know what the weather is going to do. I am 10 years old, and I know that probably sounds like something a 10-year-old says, but I mean it seriously." He posted this at the end of road letterbox and walked back to number 4, and the day was grey and cold and ordinary, and none of it told him anything. Lupin's reply came in 6 days. It was a single page, and it said, "You are right that something is going to happen. I cannot tell you what it is or when, not because I don't trust you, but because there are rules I have to keep that are not about trust, and I have been keeping most of them for 3 years, and I am not going to stop now. What I can tell you is this. When it happens, I need you to know that you are not alone. You have not been alone since the summer you were 7. Whatever comes next, that is still true." Below that, a single line that was not quite a postscript. "Trust the compass, not the needle." Harry read this in the back bedroom at Mrs. Figg's on a Saturday afternoon in December, while the grey light came through the window and Mr. Tibbles slept at his feet. He read it several times. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket with the others he was keeping now, the ones from the last year that the inside coat system had kept safe. He thought about the summer he was 7, the letterbox at the end of Privet Drive, the 9 envelopes and the stamps from his pocket money jar, and the long walk home with something adjacent to hope. 3.5 years. In his office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore received Mrs. Figg's winter report in the first week of December. It was much as her reports had been for the past 2 years. Harry was well enough. The relay arrangement was functioning. There had been no indication of a statute violation. She noted that Harry seemed, she used the word she had used before, steady. She did not say anything that was a reproach. She had stopped doing that. Dumbledore sat with the report for some time. He had made his peace, after a fashion, with the correspondence. Made peace was perhaps too clean a phrase for what had actually happened, which was more like he had looked at the situation from every angle available to him, and found that the angles all led to the same place. To intervene legally, he would have to record Harry's location with the ministry, which would expose the blood protection to any ministry record that might be accessed by those he could not fully trust. To intervene in any other way would require Lupin's cooperation, and Lupin had demonstrated 18 months ago in a rented room that his cooperation on this point was not available. The correspondence continued. Harry was intact. The blood protection was intact. He thought about what it meant that Harry would arrive at Hogwarts in the autumn of 1991, having spent 4 years in correspondence with someone who had loved his parents, having a name in his head. Remus. That meant something. A face he had seen on a wall in October, a photograph in his jacket pocket. Having been told, consistently and for years, that what made him himself was what he chose in the small moments. This was not what he had planned. He was not certain it was worse. In the spring, Harry wrote one more letter before the school year ended. It was about the Arctic book, which he had finished, and about magnetic north versus true north, and about the specific problem of the explorer who had gone too far in one direction before realizing his compass was off and had to find his way back. About how the finding the way back was harder than the going wrong, because by the time you knew you were wrong, you had to undo all the distance. He didn't know why he was writing about this. He wrote it and posted it, and waited for what came next. Lupin's reply arrived in May. It said, "I know an explorer who navigated by stars instead. They're slower and harder to read, and you have to be patient with them. But they don't have the magnetic problem. They just show you true north." Harry read this at Mrs. Figg's on a Saturday in the bright spring light, with the grey kitten now a year old and fully at home in the house, asleep in the patch of sun by the window. He was 10 years old, and something was coming, and he was ready. He didn't know for what, precisely, but he was ready. For 3 weeks, the letters had been arriving. Harry had not told Lupin. He had wanted to understand it first. The letters with the wax seal and the unusual address, Harry Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, and later, with an exactness that suggested someone was watching, the smallest bedroom. The way they arrived in quantities that escalated past anything Vernon's blocking strategies could manage. He had watched the numbers climb and thought, this is what something coming looks like. He had been right in November that something was going to happen. He had not expected it to announce itself through the letterbox 100 times. The Dursleys had taken him, with Dudley, with Petunia's fur coat, with Vernon's expression of a man at war with something he could not name, to a hut on a rock in the middle of a grey and angry sea. The hut was cold and damp, and the wind came through where the walls had stopped agreeing with each other. Dudley was asleep on the only proper surface. Vernon had a rifle somewhere. Petunia sat in the corner and made herself small. Harry sat on the damp floor and counted down to midnight. He had scratched the count in the dust. He thought about what he knew, the broom sports and the chemistry and the school in Scotland and the thing his parents had not died in a car crash of. The letters with the seal. Trust the compass, not the needle. He knew. He had known, in the way you knew a shape before you knew its name. The sea shook the hut. Something in the structure of the roof disagreed with the wind. Harry watched the seconds. He had never in his life been so certain something was about to happen as he was at 11:59 on the 31st of July, 1991. The knock came at midnight. It was not a knock, exactly. It was what a knock sounded like if the person knocking had never had to be gentle with a door. The whole hut trembled. Vernon was awake and at the rifle. Dudley woke screaming. Petunia pulled Dudley to her in the corner. The door shivered on its hinges. The door gave way. What stood in the doorway was the largest person Harry had ever seen. He filled the doorframe the way the doorframe had not known it could be filled, side to side and top to bottom, hands the size of rubbish bin lids, boots that left watermarks on the floor as he came in. He had wild black hair and a bushy black beard, and beetle black eyes that found Harry in the dim of the hut, with what Harry could only describe as relief. He was carrying, incongruously, a pink umbrella. He had to bend to get through the door and bent the door further in the process. "Couldn't find a broom," he said, apparently to no one. Then to Harry. "Harry, last time I saw you were a baby. Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." He turned to the stove and made tea. Vernon raised the rifle. Hagrid looked at it and bent the barrel, mildly, with one hand. Vernon did not raise the rifle again. The tea was made. Harry accepted a cup and a slightly squashed cake from Hagrid's coat pocket. It said, "Happy Birthday," in green icing, and had been sat on, but Harry ate it because he was hungry and because it was a birthday cake, and he hadn't had one before. Hagrid settled himself on a pile of wood that compressed under him and fixed Harry with the beetle-black eyes. "Harry," he said, "you're a wizard." This was, in canon, the moment everything changed. Harry sat with the cake in his hand and the word in the air and looked at Hagrid's enormous, earnest face. He thought about broom sports. He thought about chemistry. He thought about a school in Scotland that had never been named. He thought about the photograph that moved in his jacket pocket. He thought about the very precise way Remus had consistently declined to say the things he was not saying. He nodded slowly. "I thought it might be something like that," he said. Hagrid stared at him. The beetle-black eyes moved across Harry's face, as though looking for the part of him that was supposed to be surprised. "How could you possibly?" He stopped. He started again. "Who told you?" "Your aunt and uncle wouldn't have said a word. I know that for a fact." "Someone wrote to me," Harry said. "When I was 7. I wrote first, actually. There were names on a piece of paper in a shoebox, and I wrote to all of them." He paused. Remus Lupin wrote back. The silence that followed this was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a very large man sitting very still. Hagrid's face went through several things in quick succession. Something like laughter, then something like tears, then brief anger at someone not present, then the look of a man who has just heard something he needed to hear for a very long time. "Remus," Hagrid said. It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. It was the word of a man confirming something to himself. "Yes." "Remus wrote to you." A pause. "All this time." 4 years, Harry said. "We write every few weeks. He lives somewhere north, I think. We met once, in October 2 years ago. He sat on a wall with me for an hour." Hagrid pressed one enormous hand against his face. His beard moved around it. "Does Dumbledore know?" "I think so," Harry said. "I think he found out fairly early on." Another silence. Then Hagrid removed his hand from his face and looked at Harry, and his expression had settled into something that was still several things at once, but calmer. "He's a good man, Remus is," he said. He said it in the way you said something you had been wanting to say for a long time, and had not had anyone to say it to. He was one of your father's best friends. After everything, he had a hard go of it. Not an easy life. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm very glad he wrote to you." Harry thought about the notebook paper letters, the back pages used for calculations, the questions rationed to 1 per letter. "So am I," he said. After that, Hagrid told him things. He told Harry about his parents. Not a car crash, which Harry had known for 4 years, but a murder, which Harry received with the stillness of someone whose grief had arranged itself around the shape of a truth years before the truth arrived, killed by a man Hagrid named as Voldemort, and then apologized for naming. "Sorry, but Dumbledore says fear of the name, and Harry said he didn't mind. He'd just like to understand," Hagrid explained. He explained about what this man had been, and what he had done, and how, on the night Harry was a year old, whatever Lily had done when she stood between Harry and the curse had turned it back. He explained this with the imprecision of a man relaying something he understood in feeling better than in fact. But Harry understood the shape of it. His mother had died trying to save him. The thing that had come for him had been deflected. The scar was the record. He explained about Harry's fame, which was perhaps the strangest piece of information of the evening, that in a world Harry had never been allowed to enter, his name was known. People raised glasses to him, gave children his name. Harry thought about a 7-year-old on the cupboard floor writing 9 letters. He thought about what the years between had made him instead. Hagrid told him about Gringotts, where his parents had left him money. He told him about Hogwarts, which was, Harry felt this arrive, the school in Scotland, the one Lupin had never named in 4 years of letters, the one Lupin had gone to with his father. Harry had not known until this moment that he was going. He let this sit. "When I get to Hogwarts," Harry said, when Hagrid had finished, when Vernon had been subdued and Dudley had been given the pig's tail and the hut had settled into the particular chaos of a scene played out. "Will Remus be there?" Hagrid paused over his tea. He had a small cup in a very large hand, and the contrast was genuinely difficult to process. He thought about the question with the face of a man who wanted to say yes, and was working out what was true. "Not this year," he said, finally. He isn't at Hogwarts just as now, but—" He paused again. Something shifted in his expression, something careful and considered. Maybe someday. Harry sat with this. He had been sitting with things for 4 years. He was good at it. He set this one down beside the others. Outside, the sea was enormous and indifferent. Hagrid fell asleep almost immediately with a sound like distant drilling. The Dursleys retreated to whatever corner held them. Harry lay on the floor in the damp and looked at the ceiling of the hut. He was 11 years old and a wizard, and his parents had been murdered, and he was famous in a world he'd never seen. And in 3 weeks, he was going to the school that had been unnamed in 4 years of careful letters. All of this was the shape that had been pressing itself against the dark for years. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the photograph. He fell asleep like that, in the hut on the rock in the sea. King's Cross on the 1st of September was a station like any other station. Ordinary people with ordinary luggage moving in ordinary directions. Except for the trolley Hagrid was pushing, which had an owl on it, and the trunk that kept sliding, and the fact that Harry was carrying 4 years of accumulated knowledge in his chest cavity, and hadn't said a word about it to anyone he was about to meet. He had been to King's Cross before, once, on a school trip. He remembered the high roof and the pigeons, and the smell of diesel and something warm from the station cafe. It was the same now, exactly the same, except that Harry was different, and he was looking for a platform number that wasn't on any board. Hagrid walked him through the concourse with the immovable confidence of a half-giant who had been doing this for a long time and had never in his life been uncertain about where he was going. Harry kept pace and looked at the ordinary people and thought that 2 months ago he had been one of them, more or less, in the sense that he had known exactly as much as they knew about the world they were all moving through. He was still thinking about this when he saw Lupin. He was standing at the edge of the concourse by the departures board, with his hands in the pockets of the same worn coat he had been wearing on a wall in October 2 years ago. His hair had more grey in it than Harry remembered. He was watching the crowd with the quality of attention Harry had come to recognize from 4 years of letters. Precise, patient, not missing anything. He saw Harry at approximately the same moment Harry saw him. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, because Lupin didn't do surprise in the theatrical way, but a kind of arriving, a settling into the moment of a man who has been carrying something toward a destination and has reached it. Harry stopped. Hagrid, who had not seen Lupin, continued for a moment, and then stopped too, following Harry's line of sight. A sound came out of Hagrid that was partly a syllable, and partly just a noise. The specific noise of a person seeing something they hadn't expected, and not having time to find a word for it. "He's my friend," Harry said, from the letters. He crossed the concourse. Lupin was 31 years old and pale, and wore the wrong coat for the weather, and looked at Harry with the look Harry had been seeing in letters for 4 years, the look of someone who was glad about something, precisely, and without needing to perform it. "You didn't have to come," Harry said. "No," Lupin agreed. "I couldn't not, though." They stood for a moment in the middle of King's Cross, with the ordinary world moving around them, with the pigeons and the diesel and the departures board listing times and destinations. Hagrid arrived beside them, very large, very still, looking at Lupin with an expression Harry had no name for, which was something like relief and something like grief, and something like the face of a man who has just found something he had thought was lost. They said something to each other, the two of them. Hagrid quiet for once, Lupin's voice low. Harry let them have it. It wasn't his. It was older than him. Then Lupin turned back to Harry. He looked at him the way he had looked at him on the wall in October, the way of someone who had been seeing a person for a long time and was storing the seeing for later. "It's the barrier between 9 and 10, Lupin said. "Walk at it like you mean it." "I know," Harry said. "Hagrid told me." "Right." A pause. "You'll be all right." "I know that too." Lupin made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then he was quiet for a moment, and the moment had a different quality than the rest of the morning. Harry understood that something was ending and something was beginning, and the two things were happening at the same time in the same station, and that this was how most important transitions worked, all at once, in the middle of ordinary life. "Thank you," Harry said, "for writing back." Lupin said, "Thank you for writing." There was nothing else that needed saying after that, which did not mean it wasn't a long moment. Harry and Lupin stood in King's Cross with the weight of 4 years between them, and also above them and around them, and then Harry picked up the handle of his trolley and turned toward the platforms. Hagrid walked him to the barrier. He seemed reluctant to stop walking, which Harry understood. Hagrid was not a man who liked to leave things incomplete, and this felt incomplete even though it wasn't. Harry told him it was all right. He could find it from here. Hagrid pressed something into his hand, the ticket, which Harry had been holding already, and Hagrid seemed to realize this and said, "Well, anyway." And then Harry pushed his trolley at the solid-looking wall between platforms 9 and 10, and the wall was not solid. Platform 934 was not like King's Cross. It was steam and noise, and the Hogwarts Express, scarlet, vast, entirely real, and people who said goodbye in the particular way of people who had done this before, and owls and cats, and the smell of something Harry didn't have a word for yet, but would come to associate with arriving somewhere. He put his trunk in the luggage rack and found a compartment. A few minutes later, the door slid open. A boy stood in the doorway, red-haired, slightly freckled, with a smudge on his nose that suggested something had happened to him on the way to the platform, and he hadn't noticed. He looked at Harry with the open, direct quality of someone who had grown up in a house with many siblings and had therefore never needed to be careful about first impressions. "Everywhere else is full," he said. "Is it all right if I—" "Yes," Harry said. "Sit down." The boy sat. He said his name was Ron. Harry said his name was Harry. Ron seemed briefly to recognize something, and then to decide it could wait. They talked about other things instead. Sweets from the trolley, a rat called Scabbers, who turned out to be asleep in Ron's pocket, the question of which house either of them would be in. Harry didn't know enough about houses to have an opinion. Ron had strong opinions about all of them, mostly inherited. Outside the window the platform moved, and then the platform was gone. The train was moving. Harry turned to look back through the glass. The platform was receding, the crowd thinning, the faces of the people who had come to see their children off becoming smaller and less distinct. He found Lupin. He was standing where Harry had left him, on the Muggle side of things, not through the barrier, because he couldn't be, not yet, watching the train. As Harry watched, Lupin raised one hand. Harry raised one hand back, though by then the train had carried him too far to know if it was seen. He turned back to the compartment. Ron was attempting to perform a spell on Scabbers that he seemed to have learned from one of his brothers, and the rat was ignoring it with the expression of a rat that had seen this before. Harry reached into his jacket pocket and touched the photograph. He thought about a morning 4 years ago in a cupboard under the stairs at 4 Privet Drive on his 7th birthday, when nobody had acknowledged the date, and he had found a shoebox, and inside the shoebox had been a piece of paper with names on it. He had copied the names in the careful handwriting of a child who had taught himself to write neatly, because neatness seemed like something that might help. He had written the same letter 9 times. He had walked to the letterbox at the end of the road with his pocket money stamps and posted all 9 envelopes, and walked home with something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it, and waited. 8 of the 9 had said nothing. One had said, "Dear Harry, I did know your parents." He thought about 4 years of letters on notebook paper, back pages used for calculations, questions rationed to 1 per envelope. He thought about a hand-drawn birthday card with a dog named Mooney and a postscript that said, "I hope your day is better than most." He thought about a man sitting with a blank sheet of paper, knowing what was coming, and finding the words that would still be true after it arrived. He thought about a wall in October and a photograph that moved in his inside pocket. He thought about a man who had had every reason not to write back, and who had chosen differently. Outside the window of the Hogwarts Express, the English countryside passed in bright September colour, the specific gold and green of a morning that did not know it was supposed to be significant. Harry Potter, 11 years old, watched it go, and thought about the things you received when you asked for them, and the things you received when someone decided to give them without being asked, and about the difference between the two, and about which kind mattered more. He had not been alone since the summer he was 7. He was not alone now.